today we are focusing on tables and fonts. Okay, and so this might be a little bit odd because you might think, well, this is supposed to be a data visualization course. Why are we talking about tables? But tables are actually a form of data visualization, right? You're taking data and you're reducing it into a format that people can visualize through a table format rather than like a plot format, right? And then fonts, we will focus on quite a bit less than tables, but I'll just say sort of as an overarching thing, fonts make a huge difference in the sort of overall look and feel of a website, of a dashboard, of a visualization itself. So it's one of those things, at least in my opinion, where it's like, well, who really cares? It's just one font versus another. But when you actually tweak the fonts, it will, I think you if you're like me anyway, you'll be surprised at how much it changes the actual look and feel of the thing. Okay. There's also, and I won't really talk about this much, but there is a whole range of fonts that are more or less accessible to different people. So basically, like this type of font is going to be very accessible because it doesn't have like a lot of serifs and fanciness, right? So that's another thing to just kind of keep in mind. But mostly it's just about the look and feel of things. Okay, so today, when we're talking about tables, we're going to talk about GT primarily. Okay, and we will also, oh, this is messed up. This is not exactly true anymore. This is true. This part is not, and I'll mention why here in just a second. But so we're going to talk about GT. We will also, so the agenda is just kind of not right. We'll talk about GT, but we're also going to talk about Reactable, which is that interactive data table one that Akila introduced us to very briefly. Okay, so we'll talk about both of those. And then we'll talk about fonts fairly quickly at the end. So the learning objectives, the primary learning objective is to be comfortable with the basics of GT, okay? I think GT is a really nice package. It's at this point quite well developed, and it's really good for creating tables. There's a bunch of other options out there, and so I will mention some of those, but this lecture will focus primarily on GT for two reasons. One, it's a super powerful package. I think it's really nice. But two, I think it's a little underutilized out there in our world relative to other packages. Like many of you have probably used Cable and Cable Extra, the Cable Extra package. It's a great package. GT, I think, is actually even a little bit more simple and more powerful, actually. But Cable, that's not to say that there's anything wrong with Cable Extra. I think Cable Extra is a great package. Okay, and then understand how to use additional fonts if you so choose. Okay, so this is not, fonts are never going to be something that I'm going to require you to change, but it is something that you can do to really change your thing, whatever it is. Okay, this is the logo for GT. This logo to me is like the definition of like, holy crap, we're going too far with these logos. I think this is a crazy logo, but it looks really nice. And that's kind of the point, is that you create really nice looking tables without hopefully too much work. So GT is developed by RStudio, by people at RStudio. And so because of that, it's going to be pipe oriented, right? Pipe friendly. You could theoretically do it without pipes, but it would get really messy really quick. And so it's supposed to be kind of like in the same vein as ggplot, where you're sort of adding layers, but those layers are passed through with pipes instead of the plus. And then each layer isn't necessarily adding something on top of it like it is with ggplot. It's just modifying the table somehow. So the order may or may not matter as much as it does with ggplot. Okay. Things like spanner heads and groupings, like row groupings, used to be so much work. And with GT, they're just like almost automatic. So that's really nice. Cable Extra it has also expanded its functionality with those things quite a bit. So in recent years, it's become a lot easier with Cable Extra too. But man, a few years ago, that was just horrendous. One of the nice things about GT also is that it will render to HTML and PDF without even thinking about it. So you don't have to do anything extra to make it render to HTML or PDF. By default, it's going to try to render to HTML, but if you're rendering to PDF, it'll just switch the things it's doing and it'll render it to PDF. But I would say, like, generally GT is more of an HTML table package. And so some of the functionality and things are not going to directly translate to PDF as well. So it might not end up looking quite as nice. So I've already basically said all of that. Cable Extra is also a great package. GT is what I'm covering here because of the reasons I mentioned already. So this is how you would install it. Of course, if you want to install it, I don't know why I have an install here, but we should be beyond that at this point. But just generally, okay, if we're thinking about tables generally, not GT or Cable Extra or any specific package to create a table, almost always the hardest part of creating a table is getting your data in the format that you want for the table, okay? And sometimes it's super easy. Sometimes your data are already very tidy, and then you're just going to group by a couple of variables, and then you're going to summarize and compute the n and the mean and the standard deviation, and that's just what you're going to report, right? And in that case, it's really easy. But at least in my experience, most of the time, I'm going to have to move my data around some to get it in the format that I want. So we're going to do this with the 538 package, and I will give you a minute. If you want to get set up, you could follow along with me, at least for some of this. So I'll give you like 30 seconds if you want to get started to follow along, and if not, that's fine too. You can just watch. But basically, you'll just need to get GT installed, then load the 538 package, and then you should have the flying data set that looks like this. Okay, so basically, I'll just kind of filibuster here for a minute while people are still getting started. But basically, this flying data set it has different people, and then we have some information about the people. And then there's information on them, like how often do you recline your seat when you're on the airplane, okay? And how rude do you think it is, basically? So there's recline frequency, and then like how rude or not rude you think it is, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first just count a bunch of variables. I have annotated many people's code to use count. Sometimes people are doing summarize and then computing the end of multiple variables that way, or you're using group by and then count. One of the nice things about count is you never actually have to use group by. So you just say flying, and we're going to count gender, age, and recline frequency. Okay, so I'm not worrying at this point about how rude or not rude people think it is. We're just looking at recline frequency, okay? So I'm going to count those things, and I get, okay, female, 18 to 29, never. There were 24 respondents that fit in that category, okay? And there were 36 female, 18 to 29 that said once in a while, etc., okay? So this is what I want to make a table of, but of course, this is not going to make a great table right now, right? It's 53 rows long. That's not going to work for a table that I'm publishing even online most of the time, unless I'm doing an interactive table where I can have pages, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a few additional things, okay? So here's my flying. I'm going to count those variables just like I did. Then I'm going to drop NAs for age and recline frequency. So for the purposes of this table, I'm just getting rid of all NAs, okay? You could argue that's not the best thing to do, and I think you'd be right. But for the purposes of this illustration, that's what we're doing, okay? Now I'm going to pivot wider. So I want to go from here, from this long format to this wide format, okay? So I'm going to take the names from age, okay? So the new columns will come from this column. The names of the new columns will come from the age column, and I'm going to fill them with N. Okay, so the age, these will go out to new columns, and they'll be filled with the N. Okay, so what we'll end up with is the gender, the recline, or the gender and the recline frequency, and then we'll have age as the columns, and then the N's will fill the rows. Okay, so what was 53 rows long is now 10 rows long. Okay, we have our gender, female or male. Those are the only two categories represented here. And then we have our recline frequency for each of those two categories. Okay, and then over here we have we have a column for each age, and then those columns are filled with the N. Okay, so this is now showing the exact same information that I just had in my 53 row long one, but it's only 10 rows now, and this is more something that I could put on a page that I'm publishing or whatever, right? That's the part when you're creating tables that is the most difficult. And this is a pretty simple example, but in my experience, I'm very often going from wide to long, or long to wide, or long to wide and then back to long and then back to wide, just to get everything in the specific format that I want it to be in for the final table. Okay. Once you have that, the rest is usually not that difficult. Okay. So I stored this whole thing in this object I'm calling summary. All right. And when I go to make a table of it, all I have to do is say library GT, take summary, and I pipe it to GT. You could also just call GT on summary, but because we're going to be piping for additional things, I started out this way. Okay. So I have summary, pipe it to GT. Yeah, I'm glad I had this in the slides because I forgot about this. I have CSS in the slides that make my tables look slightly different than they will show up for you. So don't worry about that. They look basically the same, but they'll look a little bit different. Okay. So when you do that, you should see a table that looks fairly similar to this. Okay. It'll pop up in your viewer there in the one pane. Okay. So this is just the same thing that we just printed on the screen, but now we have an HTML table of it. All right, super simple. Okay, but this isn't a great table. It's not a horrible table, but it could definitely be better, right? So one of the things we might want to do is say, well, we're just saying female, 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 male, 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 male. We might want to just group the rows by female and male and not repeat that thing over and over and over again. Okay, this is actually one of my favorite things about GT. All we have to do is pass a group by. So we have summary, we pass group by gender, and then pass that to GT. And we end up with, this is where it looks quite a bit different on my screen and not as good. It should look better on yours, but I didn't bother messing with the CSS to fix it. But we have now female, and then we have the categories, and then we have male, and then we have the categories. Okay, so it's basically just grouped those things together. Yours, I believe, will have a thicker bottom border and a top border, I think, for these. Okay, is that what you're seeing? For those of you who are following along. Okay. Okay, so this is an example of where the table looks better with the default CSS, not the CSS I'm using for my slide. Okay, now the other thing we might want to say is, well, we've got this 18 to 29, 30 to 44, 45 to 60, greater than 60. It's not clear what these are, right? We know what they are because we created the table, but for somebody else, it's very much wouldn't be clear what those are. You could maybe guess, but it's not clear that these are age ranges. Okay, so we might want to add a spanner head above those, that says age range and then has each of those listed, right? So we're basically labeling the column, but the column happens to span multiple actual columns, okay? So that's where we would say tab spanner, okay? So almost all of the GT functions will start with this tab underscore, meaning table, right? Tab underscore spanner, and then the label is just what you want to label that thing at the top. And then the columns are the columns that you want it to label, okay? So I use this vars one, and then notice because each of these columns are named by numbers, I'm surrounding those by backticks, right? Because those are illegal column names in R, and so you have to surround them by backticks. But that's nice because when they show up, it'll just show the numbers rather than like X18 to 19 or whatever, okay? So when I do that, add that tab spanner, I get something that looks like this. Okay, and again, this is, I'm adding a tab spanner for one group of columns, but what's nice about GT is this very easily generalizes. So let's say I had 3 different groups of columns that I was going to add a spanner head on, right? Maybe it's like age range, and then we have another one that's like income range, and another one that's like whatever, something else, right? I could keep this code exactly like it is for the age range, and then I could just pipe a new layer where I would say tab spanner again, and then I would give a new label and a new set of columns, and it would just create those. Okay? So this is now looking quite a bit better. We could still do even better. For one example, right, we have right here still a variable name rather than a column header, okay? This is not the worst variable name, but similar to plots, right? I think you should never have a variable name in your table, right? You should have a label that is more human readable than a variable name typically is, okay? So all I'm going to do is say calls label recline frequency, the thing that I want to relabel, is equal to whatever I want to relabel it as, okay? Again, pretty straightforward, and our table now looks like this, okay? At this point, you could say we're probably done, right? This is probably the table that we would want to present. There might be 1 or 2 other things that we might want to do, but we're pretty close, and that's not a ton of code to get a pretty nice looking table, right? But there are still a bunch of other things that we can do with GT. So for example, we might want to align columns. Okay, so here, this is already left aligned. I think yours is center by default. So this is showing you how to left align that column. So we'd say calls align left, and then the columns are vars recline frequency. So again, maybe we want to left align one column and center align the rest of them. Then we could say calls align center and then say the other columns. One thing that we can't do with GT, at least that I don't know how to, there might be some workaround, but I haven't figured out yet how to decimal align, which is unfortunate because that's what you need for APA, right? So I know there are workarounds for Cable Extra with that. I don't know if there are with GT, but anything you're doing web-based, anything that you're doing that doesn't have to be APA, I think, you know, GT is a really good option. Okay, so there we go. That still looks exactly the same. We can also add a title. And again, whether you want to add a title directly through the table like this or whether you want to add it separately is going to depend on your output. If you're doing some HTML thing, then I would say this is probably going to be the best way to do it. Occasionally, though, you might want to actually use your header structure to label tables, because then they'll show up in your table of contents, which is really nice. All right, but here, I'm adding it directly to the table. So I'll say title is equal to airline passengers. And the subtitle is leg space is limited. What do you do? And here we go, right? And I don't think that's the best looking title, but it is a title. Okay, and I think it looks a little bit different on yours, but it'll look similar to that. And going even further, we're going to format the columns. Okay, so these columns, I'm saying mutate across these columns. So this is just before I even get to the table, right? I'm using just mutate across these columns. Take dot x, so take each value and divide it by 100. Okay, and then we're going to group by gender again. All this stuff is the same, but then I'm saying format percent. So instead of the n's, I'm treating them as percents. Okay, and what we're saying is here's the variables and decimal 0. When I say format percent, I can do that because it's already a decimal, and then it will just take them and swap them into percents. Okay. Finally, these shouldn't be highlighted here. Finally, we can also add a source note. One of the things that's nice about the source notes is that you can actually use Markdown code right within the source note. So very often you want to say, here's where the data came from for this table or whatever. So you can say tab source note, and then you just do MD for Markdown. And then you can put in a quote, this goes way out here, but you can see I'm using just Markdown code here to show a link, right? Data from 538, and then I'm putting the link to the 538 thing there. And then when it shows up like this. And again, that's the link styling for these slides. So yours would look slightly different, but that's pretty nice, I think. Right?
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Sure.
So in here, are you just changing the number and adding a percent by the end by dividing it by 100? I thought it was count.
Yeah, I think it was count. It probably doesn't make a lot of sense, but at least you're seeing how to create a percent. So yeah, I don't think these are actually percents. I think I just pretended they were percents.
Cool, cool. Thanks for clarification.
Yeah, that is confusing though. I agree. I should have actually made them into percents, but apparently I didn't. But for the source note, you can add that there with the Markdown code. And then we can also color cells. So this is, again, not something we probably want to do in this case. But if we did want to, this is how we would do it. Okay, so I'm saying across these variables, so these columns, we're going to color them according to a numeric color scale where the palette starts with this color and ends with this color. Okay, those are just two HTML colors that I have. The domain, if you specify the domain equal to null, it will figure out the domain. So it'll basically look at the range of across all those columns and then color it according to that color scale. Okay, and so what we end up with is something that looks like this. So this is, again, this is very much more along the lines of you might want to do this if you were to have an HTML table, but probably not for PDF. But what's nice about this is like the first example where we've seen of data visualization with the table that goes beyond what is sort of typical of a table, right? Because what you have here now is basically a table with a heat map sort of overlaid on top of it, okay? And one thing I want to point out here that I think is pretty impressive about this is that the font color actually automatically changes for you depending on how colored in that cell is, depending on the color of the cell. So over here, it says 19% in black, right? Whereas right here, it says 39% in white, because it will switch from black to white if it makes that font more visible in white as opposed to black. Okay, so I think that's pretty neat and quite nice, and a way to sort of dress up your table a bit. Okay, so what else? That's obviously a very quick overview of GT, but hopefully that got you sort of introduced into how to create tables with GT. There's a bunch more that we could do. I think let's just check out the website really quick. This is the website. They have a bunch of different things. In fact, this will take you to an RStudio Cloud where you can walk through some of this stuff. There's a bunch of other things in here. I think looking at this case study with GT cars is a nice thing to do. So it will take you through a lot of what we just did, kind of step by step. How do we create these tables and what are some of the things we can do? Okay. Some of you may be familiar with Thomas Mach. He is the person who created Tidy Tuesday initially, right? And he leads Tidy Tuesday now. He does a lot of stuff with tables. That's kind of become a niche that he has filled. And so if you go to his blog, he has a bunch of different tutorials on tables, some of which will take you quite a bit further. So he also really likes GT, so he has a bunch of stuff with GT, and he walks you through a bunch of different things, including things like this where you have spark lines. And I'll show you a couple examples of how to create these, but pretty nice stuff, right? So then you can have a table that has something like this, right? So here's the actual numbers, and then you have this little spark line on the side with a box plot in this case, okay? And he has a bunch of different, so I have 3 of them linked here, but he has a bunch of different tutorials to walk you through creating really nice tables. And most of what he does is with GT, not all of it, but most of it. A few other table options. So I mentioned Cable Extra as I think the other most prominent. So I'll just walk you through a couple things here with it. So here, because I think it's a great package as well, and it's a totally reasonable alternative to GT. And in some ways is preferred because you can do things like decimal align, and it's super well established. So there's lots of different tutorials and things out there. The help documentation is quite nice also. Okay, so we have Knitter. It builds, so Cable is the basic functionality to create a table that is from the Knitter package, right? And so Cable Extra builds off of that functionality. It takes what is the default Knitter cable and it adds a whole bunch of different options so you can dress it up and make it much nicer. Okay, so here I'm creating an object called DT, which is just the first 5 rows of the empty cars data set and the first 6 columns. Okay, so here is an example where I'm taking DT and then I'm saying cable styling is striped. So that's going to give us a similar look to GT. And then the column, we pipe that to column spec. We're saying for columns 5 through 7, bold equals true. Okay, so it's going to bold the variables in columns 5 through 7. So similar sort of pipe oriented, and fairly quickly here we have a nice looking table again. We can also do things like this. So I've now, after bolding them, I'm saying, okay, for row spec, so we have a column spec here to bold these ones. And now we're using a row specification here where we're saying for rows 2 and 4, we're going to bold them. We're going to make the color basically a white color, and then we're going to make the background this blue color. Okay, and that gives us now a different kind of striped table where the striping is with this blue, but we have this still gray for the header. Okay. You can also do this row packing. So this is similar to the group by with GT. It's a little bit more complicated, but it's not too bad. So we are taking cable styling, right, striped, and then we say pack rows group 1, that's the label, and it's going to be from row 1 to row 3. So those are the arguments, the label, and then where the rows should start and where they should end. Okay, 1 to 3. Label rows, so now I'm just adding, this is just straight up CSS, but you can add that if you want to. So I'm saying the background color is this 666, which is this dark gray color, and then color is going to be the color of the text. FFF is white. Okay, and then I'm piping to pack rows again, and I'm saying group 2, and now this one's going to start at row 4 and end at row 5. Same sort of thing here. Okay, so I would argue this is maybe a little bit more complicated to do the row packing, they're calling it, for Cable Extra. With GT, it's just that group by. Okay, but it is nice, and you can add CSS directly to it. Again, the CSS though is only going to be if you're using HTML. If you're doing PDF, I'm not sure if it will basically translate this to the corresponding LaTeX code or not. I'm not sure. I know you should be able to do a similar sort of thing with PDF, but I'm not sure if you pass it the CSS like that, if it'll have the same result, because CSS is for HTML code, right? Okay, so that's basically all I'm going to say with Cable Extra. There are tons of other options with Cable Extra as well, and it also does work well with PDF and HTML. So one of the things you might be asking though is, okay, we've talked mostly about HTML, and then I've mentioned that many of them render to PDF. Well, what about Microsoft Word, right? Most of our collaborators use Microsoft Word exclusively. So it would be nice to have something that works well with Microsoft Word. And I agree, that would be nice. There is a package called Flex Table. This is by, I'll just go here for a second. This is by this guy, David Gohl. He has created quite a few things that's supposed to work with Microsoft Word. So he created the Officer package, that quite a few things that are supposed to work with Microsoft Word well with R Markdown. Okay, I don't know the Flex Table package all that well, but they did just create this new book on it that has a bunch of overviews of it. And the idea is that it basically works similar to Cable Extra or anything like that. The code obviously is going to be a little bit different, but then it will render to Microsoft Word much more directly than Cable Extra or something like that. Okay, because in my experience, GT and Cable Extra and basically any of these table generating R packages just don't work all that well with Microsoft Word. And so Flex Table appears to be the most promising for that sort of direction, if that's where you're going. Okay. All right, there's also many others, way too many for me to cover here. So there's Huxtable, which is pretty nice. Formatable, DT. DT is another RStudio one. It used to be my favorite for Shiny, but now my favorite is Reactable, which we'll talk about next. Okay. There's also R hands-on table. I always want to say R handsome table, which I think would also be a good name. For modeling in particular, there are these Stargazer, Pixie Dust, and Model Summary ones that are pretty nice, where they will take a model object and automatically create a table for you. So that's nice. And for descriptives, there's this GT Summary package. And I want to mention this real quick just because it is pretty impressive. So what you do is you just select some variables, and then you say table summary for that, and it creates a summary for you like this. So it has the N, and then the number of missing, and then this is a categorical variable, so it breaks it out for you like this, right? And very, very quickly creates pretty nice looking summary tables for you. So that's pretty nice. And then a model summary is a similar sort of thing. So this is for descriptives, and this is for model output. But I think these maybe are not by the same person, but they're both built off of the GT package. So those are both worth checking out. Okay, so that's sort of it for static tables. Obviously, I spent most of the time focusing on GT, but this is just to mention that if GT is not working for you, there are many other options. My preferred workflow is to start with GT. If that doesn't work for me, I go to Cable Extra. If that doesn't work for me, then I start to hunt around these other ones. But if you know you're going to go to Microsoft Word, you might want to check out that other one, Flex Table. Okay, that one might be worth checking out. Like I said, I don't have a lot of experience with it, but it seems promising to me. Questions on any of that before I move on? Okay. All right, now we're going to talk about Reactable, which is my favorite package for interactive tables, okay? This is an example of a reactable table. It also works great with Shiny. This is a really complicated one, obviously, and requires a lot of code to create. But this is, to me, a beautiful example of a table that is very much beautiful data viz at the same time, right? You've got this heat map looking thing over here, and you've got check marks if it's actually happened versus the probability that it will happen over here, right? You've got other little icon things over here. You've got the actual flag for each country, and this little annotation for 6 points versus 3 points versus whatever. So that's I think a beautiful table. Let's see if we can go. So here's Twitter followers, right? Another table. So the way that they have all of these demos is they show you the table and then they walk you through all the code down here. Women's World Cup, this is the one I just showed you, right? And NBA box score. This looks very much like what you would see on NBA.com or whatever. Crayon packages. This, I'll show you how to do some of this, but you can do things like this. So you have all of these different packages, and then for each of them, you can click on it and get all this additional information. So really pretty incredible, I think. And we'll just do one or two more. So here's like a dark theme one. And you can probably click on the thing, yeah, and it'll take you to the actual, take you to the actual thing. I can't go back there apparently. So that's cool. Yeah, and then let's just do one more. So this is one that just has a ton of rows, and each of these are a link. You can search for things. You can, I don't know what that is for. Right, so that's just a real quick example of it's incredibly extensible, right? Like you can do so many things with it and you can build off of it to do more things as well. Okay, so in order to get these tables to fit on here, I had to make the tables pretty small. So the tables themselves on the slides are small, but they won't be that small for you, okay? But if you want to, you can again follow along. Just go library Palmer Penguins. You'll might have to install that package. You might have to install Reactable. But then once you get that, you can just say Reactable Penguins, and it should show up for you in your viewer as an HTML table, right? And then from there, you can click the little expand button or whatever, and it'll pop out into your actual web browser if you want. Okay, so I'll give you, again, just another second to do that if you want to. And go ahead and give me a thumbs up if you have done that, if you're trying to do that. I can see some of you are trying to do that, but. All right. The other thing I want to sort of point out here is that even in these slides, this is actually an interactive table. So here I'm just switching pages, but I can also click on these things to sort them. Right, so even just with that, just saying Reactable Penguins, I have a little interactive table here, which I think is pretty impressive. All right, we'll go on. So let's say I want to rename some columns now, okay? I have penguins, I'm going to pass that to Reactable, and then the syntax here gets a little bit verbose for many of the operations. So that's just sort of maybe a bit of a limitation of the package, but I think it's fairly straightforward most of the time, not always, but quite often it's fairly straightforward. So here I have Reactable, I'm saying columns equal, and then I have this list I'm passing it. All right. We have not talked about lists yet. We will talk about lists a lot next term. They're super flexible and really nice things because they can hold and handle all sorts of information. But basically, we're going to pass a list where we're giving it the names of the existing columns. And then from there, we're using this call_def function. Okay, so call_def is the column definition, right? And it can take all sorts of different arguments. So similar to like in ggplot, when you say theme and you say, whatever, plot.title, and then you'll say is equal to, and then you say element text, and that's a function. And that element text has a whole bunch of different arguments you can pass to it. That's the same sort of thing here, right? So we have bill length millimeters. That's the column that we want to change. And then we're going to pass it this call_def function. And then inside of here, we can pass a whole bunch of additional arguments. Okay, I'm only doing one here, which is the name. So I'm saying for bill length millimeters and bill depth millimeters, change the name so they're more human readable. Okay, ideally, I would actually go and do this for all of the columns, but I'm only doing it for these two just for the purposes of illustration. Okay, and then from there, you can see now when my table produces it, these are now human readable, right? These ones are not. I mean, they are human readable, but you know what I mean. These are still variable names, and these are nice column headers, and that's because I've renamed them, right? Everything else is exactly the same. You can also use a function within that function to rename them. So here I'm saying, okay, so I'm using, instead of passing the specific column name, I'm saying default column definition. So the default, right, for everything else I'm not going to do. I'm passing a column definition where I'm saying the header, the name, right, is equal to this function x. Okay, x is just a placeholder, so this is fairly complicated, right? But we'll get into functions and things a lot more next term. But just as a baseline sort of syntax, right, you're going to pass it a function where x is a placeholder for each column name. Okay, and then you're going to say string to title. So you're taking a string and you're making it title case, but you're going to gsub. So you're substituting out each underscore and replacing it with a space. So the reason I'm doing that is if we look back here, specifically back here, all of these columns have these underscores, right? So I'm replacing all of those underscores with spaces, and then I'm going to transform that whole name to title case, okay? And what we'll see is this doesn't actually work perfectly, but it gets me most of the way there. So we see we now have species, island, these are now capitalized, right? Bill length, millimeters. So this is where it doesn't quite work perfectly because mm, right, should be probably both uppercase or both lowercase. And then bill depth, flipper length, body mass, etc. Okay, so that's a little more complicated, but now we do the whole thing all at once. If we wanted to just do them one at a time, we could also do that, and that's not a big deal. Okay, moving away from that, let's say we want to make them filterable. Okay, this is amazing how easy this is. So the other one is maybe a little frustratingly complex for something that seems so simple. This is something where it's sort of the opposite. It's so simple, and yet it's doing something that is quite complicated. Okay, so here now I can click on species, and we'll see if this works. It's a little bit complicated because it's in the slides, but another species is Gentoo, right? So if I type G, perfect, it filters that table to only give me the Gentoo penguins. Okay, similarly, I could do over here, type, yeah, that's what I was worried about, things like that. Things that change how my slides actually render. But I type B there now, and we have all of only this Bisco island showing up. Okay, does that make sense? So now we have this filterable column headers. We can also make it searchable. So we just add this little search up here by saying searchable equals true, and we get this search thing up here. So we can, again, type Gen2, and now we get only the Gen2s, okay? Or whatever. And that will search across all the columns. We can also change the default pagination. So by default, it's going to be 10 rows. We can make that longer or shorter. So here I've switched it to be 3. Default page size equals 3. And then we end up with something that looks like this, right? So notice it's 115 pages now instead of 13 pages. Okay. Page jump. This is like sort of not that big of a deal, but you can change how this thing looks down here. So you can still go next, next, next. But now let's say I want to go straight to page 100. I could just type that, and there we go. Okay, so it changes that a little bit. All we do is pagination type equals jump instead of whatever the default is. Okay, and then here's that grouping that I mentioned before. So we have penguins. We're going to group by species and island. Here's our species. We don't have anything on the island. If we click on species zone, now you can see the different islands. So Adelie has 3 different islands. And when we click on those, we can see them, right? Gen2 has only 1 island, and Chinstrap has 1 island. And we can actually see that here, right? 3, 1, 1. So that's kind of neat also. You can also very regularly, when you're doing this group by thing, you want to group by like this, but then you want to actually have other information here. So in this case, right, I'm saying bill length millimeters. So for this one, I'm going to aggregate that column by giving the mean. Okay, so this is now, instead of being the bill length, this is the mean bill length for Adelie's, right? And if I pull down like this, now I get the mean for Adelie overall and the mean for Torgensen and Bisco and Dream, right? So I get separate means for each island. And then when I click down there, now I get just the individual values. Okay. So again, pretty powerful by just passing aggregate equals mean to my column definition. And then I have this format, call format digits equals 2, just so that it'll only have 2 digits instead of like 9 or something like that. All right, this is the last part of tables today. And so I'll go through this fairly quickly. But basically what we're going to do is take penguins. So you have to load this Sparkline library as well, which you may not have, but you can install it. And then all we're going to do is group by species, and I'm going to summarize bill length to make it a list. And you could also say group by species nest, and that would give you a column called data. The reason I'm doing this is just because I want the column to be called bill length instead of data, right? But then I'm passing that to mutate, and I'm just passing it to NA columns. And the reason is because those are basically placeholders for things I want to do later. Okay, so this is what my table looks like now, my data looks like. And this, if you're not familiar with list columns, and I wouldn't expect you to be because that's not until next course, this might look very odd and strange. But basically what this is here's the Adelie species, right? And this is all of the data for bill length for the Adelie species. And this is all of the data for bill length for Chinstrap, etc. Okay? All right. Now, this looks complicated. It is fairly complicated, but it's not horrid. We're doing this call definition, and we're saying for each cell, do this function, which takes this argument value. Then add a sparkline for that value where the type equals bar. Okay? And then we're doing basically the same thing here for these, but notice I'm using table bill length on those, but I'm using this index. Okay? So I have bill length, box plot, and sparkline. So bill length is we already had, but box plot and sparkline, those are the ones that I had sort of pre-assigned as NAs. Okay, and then we end up with something that looks like this. And what's cool about this too is these actually are interactive. They're hoverable, and you can they work better not on the slides, but you should be able to. Well, whatever. There it was for a second. For some reason, they don't work as well on the slides, but you should be able to basically drag and go across these things. Okay, so that's like, these sparkline things are really cool, but they're also like, this is well beyond like basic table making, right? And so it's something I kind of wanted just to mention and to put out there. It might be something you want to try to do for your final project, but maybe not too, but at least be aware that it is something that's possible if you ever want to explore it more later. Okay, so there's lots more. We're running quite short on time. We only have about 8 minutes. So I'm going to talk about fonts here for just a few minutes. One of the most amazing things is that, well, I'll get there in a second, I guess. General advice for fonts. Use different fonts to distinguish things, right? So specifically code. You should, for sure, use a different font for your code than you do for everything else. And R Markdown does this for you by default. It picks a different font for you. And you should always use a sans serif code for font, okay? Or I mean, for code, okay? Code should always be sans serif font, okay? I would really encourage you to try different fonts. It really does make a big difference in terms of how it feels, okay? You might also consider using different fonts for like different levels of headers. So you might have one font that is like your title header, a different font that's your H1 header, and then a different font that's your H2, 3, 4 header, okay? And then a different font even, again, that's your body font. But you want to make sure those fonts sort of go together, and I don't really have good advice for how to make sure that is the case other than to say, try out some things and see what you think, okay? This is the amazing part that I was getting to. There's a brand new package. It's actually been around on GitHub for a while, but brand new to CRAN package called RAG. Okay, this is by Thomas Lynn Peterson, who is an author on ggplot, works for RStudio, and basically everything he does is incredible. I had a bunch of slides about extra font on here, and I cut them all, and I instead included additional slides on Reactable, because RAG basically solves all of the problems that you typically run into when you're trying to deal with fonts. Okay, so there's a link to the announcement here. It's an alternative device, so it's a different way to actually render your plots where you can create different fonts within that, and it'll handle all of these different things. So after you install, go to Global Options, and then General, and then Graphics, and then Ag is what you want to click there. After you do that, you'll also want to actually quit RStudio and open it back up again. I think you can just do session restart. I'm not sure. But you'll want to restart RStudio to actually get that to work, all right, to get it to switch. If you're in an R Markdown document, you'll use knitr ops chunk set. So that's always there for you when you're doing your default, right? When you create the default template. And then you just do dev for the device is equal to rag png. Okay, and that's going to make everything render using rag instead. So part of what's really nice about it is it can handle all sorts of fonts, including all sorts of different languages, and even like right to left fonts, and all sorts of different stuff. Okay, it'll also automatically default or detect the fonts that you have on your computer, so you don't have to do anything special there. Once you have that stuff, the sort of prereq stuff in there, it just works, and it's crazy. This used to be a lot more work than it is now. Okay, all you do is you have your plot, and then you say theme text equals element text, family equals whatever font you want it to be, and it changes the font for you. Okay, in this case, I'm saying size equals 30 also to increase the size a little bit. All right, that's it. But it has lots of support for other things. So there's these things called ligatures, specifically in code, where it will take things like this and actually turn it into an arrow instead of the less than sign and a dash. And things like this, where it's not equal to, it'll actually change it into a not equals to sign, right? And you can use this actually in your coding if you use the right font. So like Fira code is one that supports ligatures. So with RAG, I can say, okay, here's my label, and make the family a code or a font that can handle ligatures, and it will actually do them for you. Similarly, if you want to use something like font awesome, you can say the title is equal to Twitter, and then the family for the plot title is going to be font awesome. Okay, and then we get a plot it looks like this. Okay, so notice this is an actual arrow here. We have an actual less than or not equal to sign here. And we have a little Twitter icon up there. Okay. So again, this is like astounding to me because I've fought with this stuff a lot and it just works and it's crazy. And this is like literally, this came out last week. So I had just put these slides together. I had just, updated them or whatever. And literally, I think it was the next day this announcement came out. So I had to go and redo my slides again. But it was worth it because this is really cool. And I still haven't fully explored it, but it's really nice. It also handles emojis. So you can just add in fact, I didn't even have to specify the family as this. That is what it is, but you could specify it as something else and it will still work. It also works. RAG, part of what is so nice about it and what's so difficult about fonts is it works across all operating systems. Okay, so RAG will just work and many other ones will work on your operating system and then it'll break on somebody else's. So that's not the case here. One other thing real quick, there's this show text package. I think it's pretty neat because Google Fonts is a good place to sort of get started with different fonts. There's all sorts of them and you can, a lot of them are not like the greatest, but some of them are pretty nice. And you can click on any of these. So let's go all the way down here, right? Like, let's say I'm interested in this one. I'm looking around, I'm like, yeah, okay, I want to select this light style. So I select that. And then over here, it gives me some advice on how to actually use this. So I can import it. This would be like through CSS, or I can use HTML. Okay, and then this is the CSS code to actually do that. I'll show you how to do that more later. But what is nice is with show text package, you don't actually have to have these fonts on your computer. You can just use them directly from Google Fonts. So this is only available through GitHub, at least to my knowledge, last I checked. So we do that, and then we say library show text, and then you just use this font add Google, and then you say the name of the font. And then the second argument is how you want to refer to that font later. So I'm just saying MLD and SE for these two. And then this is using the Quartz device now instead of RAG. RAG would probably work also. And then down here, you're going to say family equals, and then SE if you want that SE one, or MLD if you want that one. And you get something that looks like this. Okay. So an amazing title with the world's most boring data set. All right. Last thing, I know we're basically out of time, but I just want to illustrate why fonts matter real quick. Okay. Megaflix is the name of this store, but it certainly doesn't look like it. Right? I will always find you. Gives a little bit of a different meaning depending on the two fonts, right? And similarly, you'll always be mine. One of those communicates a little bit different message than the other, right? So that's those are sort of funny examples, but they're also true in that the feel that you get from different fonts will really change things, okay? This is super quick aside, doesn't really matter, but you can actually include something like this in a code chunk in your R Markdown file, but instead of having R as the engine, you just change it to be CSS, and then when you render, it'll change the body of your R Markdown file to that font. Okay, so that's basically all. I have this image because this is how fonts can often feel to me, just going off down deep into the hole, and hopefully you come out at some point. There's also this book if you want to learn more about fonts. Okay, so next time we're going to talk about blogs. We're going to talk about creating your own blog. It'll be very interactive, and hopefully by the end, everybody will have a blog that is actually published, even if it doesn't have much content in it, if any. Okay.